It was a garbage truck. Not a SWAT team, not a wiretap, not a decade-long sting operation ending in a blaze of headlines. The arrest that finally closed one of the most terrifying cold cases in American history began with detectives quietly arranging for a Sacramento garbage truck to follow its normal route down a quiet suburban street, and then carefully collecting what an old man had wheeled to the curb. Inside that trash bag, they found tissue. Inside that tissue, they found DNA. And within hours, a crime laboratory had produced a result that made experienced investigators go very still. The profile matched. Not a partial hit. Not a lead worth following. A match to the unidentified offender who had committed a 12-year campaign of rape and murder across the state of California and then simply vanished in 1986 as though he had never existed at all. The next morning, April 24, 2018, they came for him. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. He was 72 years old, a retired police officer, a grandfather. He came out his front door and officers moved in. He looked confused. Then he looked slack. Then the handcuffs clicked shut. No chase, no standoff. No final act of defiance. Just a quiet street in Citrus Heights, California. Just a man who had spent 44 years carrying more than a dozen murders and dozens of rapes through an ordinary suburban life, bringing groceries in from the car, waving to neighbors, growing old, right up until the morning the garbage truck didn't leave anything behind. But to understand what that arrest actually meant, you have to go back to where this story really begins. And it begins not with a crime scene, but with a man named Claude Snelling. Claude was a journalism professor at College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California. He was the kind of father who showed up at school events, at dinner, in the house every evening. He had a teenage daughter named Beth. By all accounts, they were close. By all accounts, September 11th, 1975 was a night like any other in that house. Homework done, lights out, nothing in the air that suggested anything was wrong. At some point in the early morning hours, Claude was in the kitchen when he looked out the window into the backyard. What he saw was his daughter being dragged from the house by a masked man with a gun. Claude Snelling did not hesitate. He went out the back door. The masked man shoved Beth to the ground. He turned. He shot Claude twice. Claude Snelling died in his own backyard. Beth ran. The attacker slipped into the Visalia night on foot and was gone. No car recovered, no name, no face. Just a dead father, a traumatized teenager, and a neighborhood that would never quite shake what had happened on that street. The case did not go cold right away. Visalia police surged patrols, set traps, worked the neighborhood hard. 3 months later, in December of 1975, a detective named William McGowan actually encountered the suspect during a stakeout. For one brief moment, he had him. Then, the man pulled a revolver from behind a fence, fired at McGowan, and ran. McGowan survived. The suspect vanished, and then, a few months after that, he surfaced somewhere else entirely, under a different name, doing something far worse. What you're about to hear is not a story about a monster who came from nowhere. It's the story of a man who spent more than a decade operating in plain sight, who stalked neighborhoods like a predator learns a hunting ground, who used the geography of California's booming suburbs as cover, and who wore a police badge while he did it. It's the story of the investigators who refused to let it go for 44 years. And it's the story of the survivors who carried his silence for 4 decades while the man responsible mowed his lawn and went to bed and got old. This is the case of the Golden State Killer. The murder of Claude Snelling did not happen in isolation. By the time that masked man appeared in Beth's bedroom, Visalia police had already been tracking him for well over a year. Since at least April of 1974, someone had been methodically burglarizing homes across Visalia. More than 100 break-ins in roughly 18 months. But what set this prowler apart, what made investigators increasingly uneasy as they studied his pattern, was what he was taking. Not electronics, not cash, not anything with obvious street value. He was taking small personal items, photographs, coins, objects that mattered to the people who owned them and meant nothing to anyone else. And he was doing something else. He was going back to the same homes he had already hit, moving things inside drawers and closets, leaving small signs that he had been there. Tests, almost, to see if the occupants were paying attention. In the months before he killed Claude Snelling, he had already targeted Beth Snelling's home on multiple occasions. He had been in her bedroom. He had been studying the house, learning when Claude came and went, memorizing the routine, deciding when the moment was right. When he finally came back on September 11, 1975, he came to take her. What he didn't account for was her father. After the murder and McGowan's near-miss encounter in December, the ransacker disappeared from Visalia entirely. The case stayed open and unsolved. Investigators had descriptions, behavioral profiles, and a dead professor, but no name, no face, and no idea where he had gone. They were about to find out. The Sacramento region in the mid-1970s was still figuring out what it was. Entire new neighborhoods had been carved out of the Central Valley during the previous decade. Long, quiet residential streets, ranch houses set back from the sidewalk, cul-de-sacs, side yards and back fences and canal paths running between subdivisions. The kind of place where families slept with their windows cracked in the summer because it felt safe to do that, because everyone on the block did the same thing. On June 18, 1976, a woman in Rancho Cordova, just east of Sacramento, woke up to a masked man standing in her bedroom. He was already inside. She had no idea how long he had been there. He controlled her, and when it was over, he left as quietly as he had come. This was the first confirmed East Area rapist attack, and what was immediately clear to investigators, even from that first case, was that this was not opportunistic. This man had not wandered past an unlocked window and gotten lucky. He had been watching. He knew the layout of the house. He had been there before the night he attacked. The attacks continued, one after another, through 1976 and into 1977. And the more detectives studied the pattern, the more a particular detail kept surfacing. When the victim was a woman living alone, he would bind her hands. But when he attacked couples, and he began specifically targeting couples, what he did was something else entirely. He would force the woman to tie up her husband. Then he would stack dishes or drinking glasses on the man's back and lean down and say, very quietly, that if he heard a single sound from the bedroom, if he felt those dishes shift even slightly, he would kill both of them. And then he would leave the man there, face down on the floor, listening in the dark, for however long he chose to stay. By early 1977, the fear in Sacramento's suburbs had reached a level that is difficult to fully convey now. People were sleeping with loaded firearms beside their beds. They were buying dogs specifically because of him. FBI agents reviewing the case years later would describe the atmosphere in those neighborhoods as one in which, simply, everyone was afraid. Not just the people he had attacked, but every family on every street who understood that the next name in the news could be theirs. Then he started calling them. In March of 1977, the Sacramento Sheriff's Department received a call from a man who identified himself as the East Area Rapist. He told investigators he had already chosen his next victim and that they would never catch him. That same day, another attack occurred. He wasn't just evading police. He was taunting them, daring them, and there was nothing they could do about it. For the first 2 years of the East Area Rapist series, investigators had developed a working understanding of how this person operated. He was methodical. He needed preparation. He needed a controlled setting, a house he had studied, a family whose routine he knew. That was how he functioned. That was the profile. On the night of February 2nd, 1978, Brian and Katie Maggiore were walking their poodle through a neighborhood in Rancho Cordova. They were a young married couple, out after 9 o'clock on an ordinary evening walk. a teenager jogging nearby noticed a suspicious man crouched near some bushes close to the sidewalk, watching the couple. Then she heard gunshots. Brian and Katie Maggiore were shot dead on the street. Outside, in public. No home, no controlled environment, no elaborate setup. Just two people walking a dog. And then they were gone. What investigators now had to accept was something the profile hadn't accounted for. When this man felt exposed, when something in the environment threatened the carefully constructed invisibility he depended on, he would kill whoever was in front of him and walk away. The East Area Rapist was not a man who only harmed under specific conditions. He was simply a man who had not yet been presented with the right reason to kill in the open. The Sacramento attacks continued into 1978 and then into the East Bay, Concord, Danville, and then gradually they stopped. For a moment, people may have exhaled. They should not have. On October 1st, 1979, a couple in Goleta, a quiet coastal community near Santa Barbara, survived a home invasion that bore every hallmark of the East Area Rapist. The attack failed. They got out. Investigators in Southern California noted it. But no one yet understood what that near miss was a prelude to. 2 months later, in December of 1979, doctors Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning were found murdered inside their Goleta condominium. They had been bound. There were no witnesses, no useful forensic leads, and no obvious connection, yet, to anything happening 400 miles north in Sacramento. In March of 1980, newlyweds Charlene and Lyman Smith were beaten to death in their Ventura home while they slept. Lyman's hands had been bound behind him with his own shoelaces. In August of 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington, also newlyweds, were murdered in their Dana Point home. In February of 1981, Manuela Withun was attacked and killed in Irvine while her husband was hospitalized. In July of 1981, Sherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez were murdered in Goleta. 5 major Southern California murder scenes, 9 victims, less than 2 years. Southern California detectives were working these cases hard, but they were working them as separate crimes across separate counties, and the connection to a rapist operating in Sacramento's suburbs between 1976 and 1978 was not yet on anyone's radar. They were hunting what they called the original Night Stalker. Sacramento investigators were hunting the East Area Rapist. 2 entirely different names. 2 entirely different investigations. No one connecting them. Then, on the night of May 4, 1986, a young woman named Janelle Cruz was murdered in her home in Irvine. She was 18 years old. She was home alone while her family was overseas on vacation. She was the youngest of all his homicide victims, and she was the last. After Janelle Cruz, it stopped. No more Sacramento, no more Southern California, no escalation, no arrest, no confession. Just silence, stretching out across months, then years, then decades. Somewhere in California, a man went home. He went to work. He had a family. He got older. And the cases that bore his fingerprints sat in filing cabinets across 5 counties, slowly gathering dust, each one waiting for a piece of information that hadn't arrived yet. Before we get to how he was caught, I want to pause here for a moment. Because it's easy, when you're following the timeline of a case this large, to let the scale of it pull you away from what it actually meant to real people. Elizabeth Snelling Hupp was a teenager on the night a masked man tried to drag her from her bedroom and her father ran out the back door to stop it. She grew up carrying September 11, 1975 inside her. She spent decades watching investigators work a case that never seemed to close. She gave statements. She attended hearings. She waited. Michelle Cruz lost her sister, Janelle. 18 years old, home alone, the last victim. Michelle has spoken publicly about how Janelle's murder reorganized the shape of her family's entire life. Not just grief in the weeks after, a permanent structural damage that never fully repaired itself. The vast majority of the rape survivors remain anonymous in court records, listed only as Jane Does in investigative exhibits and sentencing documents. Their anonymity reflects both legal practice and the reality of what it meant to be a sexual assault survivor in the 1970s and 1980s. The silence this man imposed on his victims did not end when he walked out their doors. For many of them, it became a permanent condition. And then there is the particular weight of not knowing. For 44 years, the people he harmed woke up every morning with the knowledge that the man responsible was somewhere, alive, breathing, living his life, and that nobody knew who he was. That is not a wound that scabs over. It is a wound that stays open every single day for 44 years. In 2001, 20 years after the last of the Southern California murders and 15 years after Janelle Cruz, a DNA result quietly collapsed two separate investigations into one. Testing confirmed that the biological profile from the East Area Rapist rape cases in Sacramento matched the profile from the original Night Stalker murder scenes along the Southern California coast. One offender. The rapist who had terrorized Sacramento had not simply stopped and gone quiet. He had moved south. He had begun killing. And then he had stopped that too and gone home, wherever home was. In 2016, the FBI and several local agencies relaunched the case publicly with a national press campaign, a substantial reward, and renewed appeals for information. Veterans of the investigation gave interviews. Victim families spoke publicly about what 4 decades of no answers had cost them. The renewed attention eventually fed into a conversation about a technique that had never been applied to a case at this scale: investigative genetic genealogy. The concept was this: crime scene DNA doesn't only confirm a known suspect, it can also help you find relatives. If investigators could locate distant cousins or second cousins of the unknown offender inside a publicly available genealogy database, people who shared enough DNA to indicate a common ancestor, they could begin building a family tree and work inward toward the person they were actually looking for. Investigator Paul Holes proposed attempting it in the fall of 2017. Genealogist Barbara Ray Venter undertook the painstaking work of building the tree. The tree narrowed. 1 branch, 1 family, 1 name: Joseph James DeAngelo, Jr., 72 years old, retired police officer, Navy veteran, former employee of a Sacramento area grocery distribution center. He lived in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. He had neighbors who waved to him. He had a driveway and a trash can and a garbage pickup schedule like everyone else on his street. Investigators put him under surveillance. They watched and waited. And then, one morning, they arranged for his trash to be collected. From the discarded tissue inside that bag, the crime lab generated a DNA profile that matched the East Area Rapist cases and the original Night Stalker murder scenes. And once investigators had DeAngelo firmly in their sights, Visalia detectives finally had the man they had long believed was their ransacker, the same man who had killed Claude Snelling in that backyard in 1975. On April 24, 2018, officers moved in. He came out his front door. It was over in seconds. 44 years. Closed by a garbage bag. Prosecutors charged Joseph James DeAngelo with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery across 6 counties, with special circumstances attached to each murder count. In April of 2019, they announced they would seek the death penalty if he went to trial. The discovery in the case exceeded 1.3 million pages. A contested capital trial, prosecutors estimated, could take as long as 10 years to complete. A burden that would have fallen on survivors who were already aging, on witnesses who were in their 70s and 80s, on families who had already waited long enough. After extensive consultation with victims and their families, prosecutors accepted a plea. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to all 13 murders, all 13 kidnapping counts, and admitted to 161 uncharged crimes against 61 additional victims. He gave no real explanation. He delivered no account of why. He sat in a wheelchair in an outdoor Sacramento courtroom, gaunt, diminished, expressionless, and said the words the law required him to say, and that was all he gave them. Then, before sentencing, the people he had harmed were given the chance to speak. For 3 days, survivors and family members came to a microphone and stood in front of the man who had upended their lives, and they told the court, and told him, exactly what he had actually done. Not the legal summary, the real version. A woman described never sleeping in the dark again. A family described a marriage that did not survive. Elizabeth Snelling Hupp stood in that courtroom, the girl from that Visalia bedroom, now a grown woman, and spoke directly to the man responsible for her father's death. He had to sit there and hear her. After 44 years, she finally had that. On August 21, 2020, the court sentenced DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the 13 murder counts, plus an additional consecutive life term for the kidnapping convictions, plus 8 years for weapon enhancements. The court formally recognized crimes against 87 individual victims at 53 separate crime scenes. He will die in prison. In a legal sense, this case is closed. The man was identified, arrested, pleaded guilty, and is serving consecutive life sentences with no possibility of release. That part is done. But there are questions this case will never fully answer, and I think it's worth being honest about that. No one knows why he stopped. After Janelle Cruz in May of 1986, the attacks simply ceased. He was in his late 30s. He had been at this for over a decade. He didn't move, didn't get sick, didn't get arrested for anything else. He just stopped, and then continued living his life in the Sacramento suburbs for 32 more years before anyone knew who he was. No one knows the true full scope of what he did. He formally admitted to 161 uncharged crimes. Investigators believe that number is almost certainly an undercount. The Visalia burglaries alone likely numbered well into the hundreds. There may be people alive today who never connected an unsettling incident from decades ago to the man in the headlines. And the 1974 murder of a teenage girl named Jennifer Armour in Tulare County remains officially unsolved. Investigators placed DeAngelo on a short list of suspects after his arrest. No charge was ever filed. That file is still open. Joseph James DeAngelo has never offered a real public explanation for any of it. He muttered fragments to himself in an interrogation room after his arrest. Disjointed, self-referential, impossible to verify, and prosecutors publicly treated those remarks with skepticism. His guilty plea secured accountability and sentence. It did not secure answers. A journalism professor went out a back door in Visalia in 1975 because he saw his daughter and he ran toward her without thinking twice. He deserved better than what this case was ultimately able to provide. So did all of them. That's going to do it for today's story. Thank you for spending your night with me. If this case stays with you the way it stayed with me, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment and I'll see you in the next one.